welcome back to the second segment of the Finance Forum with myself, Abdu-Raof Hanslo, and my guest in the hot seat, Mohammed Jaffer from Mojaf Financial Services. We're speaking financial planning. Mohammed, before the break, I touched on a very pertinent point. I think that we need a little bit of clarity on that. Would be endowments.
Yes, Abdu-Raof. I think you touched on a very old product.
Yeah.
And back in the day, that was most probably one of the only products that people were offered. And yes, it wasn't offered to people, it was sold to people.
Yes.
And unfortunately, the way it was structured back then, it was the advisor and the service providers, the insurance companies that used to make big money on these products.
Yeah.
And you're correct in what you said, that the first 2 years, many a times, and I'm sure many of our people can relate to this, that when after 2 years of paying your premiums of 2,000, 3,000, if not more, you see that the value of your investment is worth almost nothing. Because the first 2 years, the formula used to be, is that they take the premium times the number of years that the product is signed up for, and then they work their fees on that. And then the advisors or the brokers then were paid what they call an upfront fee, meaning that that commission is calculated on the premiums over the duration of the product. And the advisor were paid the upfront fees. And so too, the insurance companies got paid their fees. Hence the reason, if you terminated the product before its the maturity date, there were penalties that came in to recover all the different costs. Now, to me, firstly, that I believe is totally wrong, because how can you pay somebody for advice that you haven't received over that period? You are paid, the advisor and the company is paid a fee for the duration of the product, but the advice hasn't been given for so many years as yet. That's number one. Number two is, why should the advisor and the company be paid right up front? What about you as a client that are investing for a purpose? So hence the reason why I believe that unfortunately many people who are in endowments today are actually they're in the wrong products. But we will talk about that because of the tax implications, yeah, and all those. But that's just an example of how people are actually in the wrong investment, because maybe it was the only product at the time, or the advisor only knows about those products. But that's a discussion for another day.
I think the importance to realize is that there is a place for every product in the financial planning. And I think we've discussed this in absence of the camera at extent. Basically, that every product has a space and every product has a time for everyone. So we will cover that eventually. But in the interim, Mohammed, while chatting about this, obviously there does come times, or there are times when advisors do render incorrect advice, or do place the client into the wrong product that's not suitable to their need, or ultimately there's a performance issue at the end of the day. And as with the medical profession, there's a council called the Health Professionals Council of South Africa that oversees the medical side of things. Obviously in finance, now this being more a regulated type of industry, and a few years back we saw the launch of the Financial Advisory and Intermediary Service Act, which basically governs exactly your profession, on how exactly your code of conduct should be within the space. Is there a professional body that oversees you? Now, we've spoken to extent about the Financial Planning Institute of South Africa. Are there other bodies that do oversee your profession and basically implement regulation and take complaints?
Absolutely, Abdu-Raof, and I think that's one of the good things that has happened to the industry, that when it became regulated in 2002, 2003, when the Phase Act came into being, I think that was one of the best things that could have happened to the industry, because then we saw the birth of the regulatory body that oversees the industry. Before, if you had a complaint, you had to go and fight with these big insurance companies that had flaws of attorneys and advocates working for them, and you had no chance. Now you are put on a level footing where you can lay a complaint to the Financial Services Board, as we know at the FSB, and your complaint is dealt by the FSB. And you now have somebody that you can complain to, and that will do representation on your behalf, and they will determine if it's a legitimate claim or if it's a legitimate complaint, and they will decide on what should be done regarding your complaint, and not the actual provider that you complain to, because obviously the provider will look in its own interest, where the FSB, the Ombudsman, will actually look at the merits of the case and determine, and I'm sure many of us have read in the Personal Finance on the weekend of determinations in favor and against financial advisors and against the insurance houses. So yes, there's very much a watchdog, if we want to call them that, that's overseeing the industry, which is very good, and it puts you as the client in a better position, where firstly it puts the advisors in a position that they need to make sure that they give proper advice, and not up to those selling products, but rather based on what your need is. Now that is why it's so important that when you sit down with the advisor, and I personally steer away from doing what we call special needs, where somebody comes into your office and say, look, I just need this to be done.
Yeah.
Now, if you do those type of things, as a client, you must realize that you are only now attending to one need in your mind. However, if the advisor does a complete analysis of your situation, he or she can see, but you don't necessarily need that. You actually need to do something else before you do that. And that's why it's so important that the advisor does a complete analysis of your situation before he gives you advice as to what you need to do.
I think to add to that question, Mohammed, about the Financial Advisor and Intermediary Service Act. In the last few years, we've seen a lot of legislation come through. Financial Intelligence Center Act, for example, that would ascertain exactly, would number one, promote the institution to get to know the client better. Number two, the Financial Advisor Intermediary Service Act. GAP, POCTA, TORA. There's a list of these, and I'm sure over the next few programs in the series we will cover those pieces of legislation. But in essence, in speaking to members of government and that, we come to realize that these pieces of legislation have been put in place for protection of everyone. Absolutely. So especially when looking at the FASE Act, the Financial Advisory and Intermediary Service Act, it's an act that basically protects the advisor on the one hand, but protects the client on the other hand, and the institution as well.
Absolutely.
So we should never look at this from a finance perspective as the Antichrist.
No, absolutely, Abdu-Raof. In fact, that's a very important point that you've raised there. That's why the process of giving advice, there's a recommendation of how it should be done. And very important, Abdu-Raof, you'll see that the advisors today, they insist on when I sit down with a client, when they sit down with a client, that everything that we discuss is minuted. We make notes of everything that I've said and what you've said and what we've agreed on. So later on, when there's a difference of opinion, then there isn't but you said and I said. We have a piece of paper that is signed by both parties, that this is what we've discussed and this is what we've agreed on, and we signed on it. So that, and in fact, when you as a client go lay a complaint at the FSB, the first thing that the Ombudsman asks us as advisors, can we see your record of advice? So that is your minute, your record of advice needs to then be forwarded to the Ombudsman and see exactly what was discussed and what was agreed upon. So that now, because we do know that there are also clients that are frivolous, you know, that at the time this is what they wanted because somebody told them this, and they insist that this is what I want to have done. But in the meantime, it wasn't necessarily that was a suitable product, but because they've heard from so and so that, you know, you need to go into that investment, they then almost pressurize the advisor into going into a certain direction. Now, if all these things are minuted, we will talk more about how you determine in which investment a person should be placed and all those type of things, but that we will discuss in depth later on.
I think, you know, Mohammed, we've given a good synopsis over these last two programs about financial planning and financial advice. We've also touched on the legislative part of the industry and the old school way of doing things. I think from the next program onwards, we'd like to look at basically unpacking the principles of financial planning. So I hope the viewers are going to enjoy this, because we're going to start at one point, or at least I'd like to start at one point, and that being starting at birth. So when a child is born, and we can eventually end off to beyond death, and so taking your entire life into account. So over the next 10 programs, we intend to unpack most of this and to give a synopsis of exactly how financial planning benefits the community.
Absolutely, Abdu-Raof, and I'm looking forward to that.
You've been watching the Finance Forum with myself, Abdu-Raof Hanslo, and my guest, Mohammed Jaffer from Mojaf Financial Services. We encourage you to stay tuned to this spectacular series on financial planning and the effects thereof for your benefit. So, stay focused to your finance. Until next time, goodbye.